44. The place of history in African society. Mythical time advances which were made in historical time, as the latter is not perceived as such by each individual, it is replaced by the historical group memory. An example of this is the Kikuyu legend about the first making of iron. God had divided up the animals between men and women. But the Women were so cruel that their animals ran away and became wild. The Hembn interceded with God on behalf of their wives, saying, "We wish to sacrifice the lamb in thy honor, but we do not want to do it with a wooden knife lest we run the same risk as our wives." God congratulated them on their wisdom, and, so that they could have more efficient weapons, told them how to smelt iron. This mythical and collective conception made time an attribute of sovereignty. The Shilluk king was the mortal repository of immortal power, for he combined in his own person both mythical time. He was the incarnation of the founding hero, and social time, regarded as the source of the group's vitality. The same thing occurs among the Bafularo of East Zaire, the Banyoro of Uganda, and the Masi of Upper Volta. For all of Whom the chief is the mainstay of collective time, the Mwmi is present, the people lives. The Mwmi is absent, the people dies. The death of the king is a break in time which halts activity and social order and all expression of life, from laughter to agriculture and sexual union between either people or animals. The interregnum is a parenthesis in time. Only the advent of another king recreates social time, which then comes back to life again. Everything is omnipresent in this intemporal time of animist thought, where the part represents and may signify the whole, and hair and fingernails must not fall into the hands of an enemy lest they give him power over their owner. Indeed, one has to go as far as the general conception of the world in order to understand the Africans' vision of time and its real meaning for them. We then see that in traditional thought, time in the ordinary sense is only one aspect of another time experienced by other dimensions of the individual. Whenman lies down at night on his mat or his bed, to sleep. That is the moment his double chooses to set out and retrace the path the man himself followed during the day, to frequent the places he was in, and to repeat the work and actions he performed consciously during his daily life. It is in the course of these peregrinations that the double encounters the forces of good and evil, both benevolent spirits and the sorcerers who eat up doubles or circos, as they are called in the Songhai and Varmint languages. It is in his double that a man's personality resides. When the Songhai say of someone that his bio double is heavy or light, they mean that his personality is strong or weak, and the purpose of amulets is to protect and strengthen the double. The ideal is to succeed in merging into one's double so as to form a single entity, which thus acquires superhuman wisdom and strength. Only the greatest initiate or master Korkonini Zama can attain this state, in which time, like space, ceases to be an obstacle. Such a one was Si, eponymous ancestor of the Songhai dynasty. Terrible is the father of the 45. Methodology and African prehistory. Si, the father of thunderbolts. When he is toothache he crunches gravel. When his eyes are sore he bursts forth in flame. He strides over the earth. He is everywhere and nowhere. Social time, history, experienced in this way by a group, amasses power, and this power is usually symbolized and given concrete form by some object which is transmitted by the patriarch, the head of the clan, or the king, to his successor. It may be a golden ball kept in a tube or wardroom, together with parts of the body of a lion or elephant or panther. Or it may be kept in a box or chest, like the regalia tibo of the Masi king. The Momg the Songhai and Varmint, the object is a rod of iron pointed at one end. The Momg the Sorko in the old empire of Gao, it was an idol in the shape of a big fish with a ring in its mouth. The Momg those who worked in iron, it was a mythical forge which sometimes grew red hot at night to express its anger. The transfer of such objects constituted the legal transmission of power. The most striking example is that of the Soyinka, descendants of Funny Barley, who have chains of gold, silver or copper, each link representing an ancestor and the whole chain representing the dynastic line back to Funny the Great. The chains are produced from the mouths of the celebrants in the course of magical ceremonies, much to the amazement of the onlookers, and when the Soyinka patriarch dies, he disgorges the chain for the last time, and it is swallowed from the other end by his chosen successor. He dies as soon as he has passed the chain over to whoever is to continue the line, a concrete will and testament which well illustrates the strength of the African conception of mythical and social time. Some people have thought that such a view of the historical process was static and sterile, placing the perfect archetype far back in the past, in the origins of time, and thus seeming to set before succeeding generations an ideal which consisted in stereotype repetition of the doings and exploits of their ancestors. Myth would then be the motive force of a history which was immobile. But as we shall see, African historical thought cannot be confined to this one approach. It must also be recognized that a mythical approach lies at the origins of every nation's history. Every history starts off as religious history, and this attitude actually accompanies historical development and reappears from time to time in various marvelous or monstrous forms. One of these is the nationalist myth, by which one famous contemporary head of state addressed his country as if it were a living person. And under the Nazi regime the myth of race, given concrete form in rituals which went back into the mists of time, condemned millions of people to the Holocaust. Are Africans aware of being agents of their own history? It is true that for some centuries the African has had many reasons for not being conscious of responsibility. He has been accustomed to so many alienating dictates coming from outside that even if he lived far from the slave. 46. The place of history in African society. Coast or the seat of the nearest white officer, some part of his soul was bound to be marked with the annihilating brand of the serf. Likewise, in the pre-colonial period, many elementary and almost closed African societies give the impression that their members were conscious of making history only to a very limited extent and on a very limited scale, often only within the bounds of the extended family and inside the framework of a customary gerontocracy hierarchy that was strict and oppressive. But even at this level, perhaps especially at this level, the feeling of autonomy, of self-regulation by the community, was vivid and powerful. The Lobi and Cobra peasant in his village, when he was master of the house, felt he had ample control over his own fate. The best proof of this is that it was in such stateless areas, where power was the thing most widely shared, that invaders, and in particular colonizers, had most difficulty in establishing themselves. Here love of liberty was proof of a taste for initiative and hatred of alienation. In highly structured societies, on the other hand, the African conception of the chief gave the latter an exaggerated position in the history of nations whose collective fate he literally embodied. So it is not surprising to find oral tradition retracing the whole original history of the Malinke in the praise to Samedi. Similarly with Funny among the Songhahi of the Niger Bend. This does not represent an ideological conditioning destructive of any critical spirit, although in societies where oral transmission is the only channel of information, the authorities, exercising control over a strong network of griots, had almost a monopoly in the diffusion of official truth. But the griots were not a monolithic and nationalized body. The later history of pre-colonial Africa shows that the place accorded to African leaders in the people's mental pictures is probably not an inflated one. A good example is Shaka, who actually forged the Zulu nation in the turmoil of combat. What both written and oral evidence tells us about Shaka's activity must have been reproduced many times during the course of African history. We are told that the constitution of the Mandingo peoples goes back to Samedi, and the part played by Osei Tutu and Anok in the founding of the Asante nation seems to correspond to the Asante's own conception of it right down to the present day. This is all the more so because the idea of a leader who acts as a motive force in history is never reduced to an oversimplified schema crediting the whole of human progress to just one man. Nearly always there is a dynamic group which is famous as such. Nor are the chief's companions forgotten even when they are of inferior status, such as griots, spokesmen and servants. They often entered history as heroes. The same thing is true of women, who, contrary to what has been repeated over and over again, probably occupy a more important position in the African historical consciousness than their counterparts elsewhere. This is the Bambara expression so tigui, do how tigui head of a village di monetary head of a canton and kili tigui general-in-chief bring out the force of this authority. 47. Methodology and African prehistory. Easily understood in the case of matrilineal societies. At the village of Wanzarb, near Terra Niger, where the succession to the chieftaincy was matrilineal. The French of the colonial period tried to bring the people into conformity with the others by appointing a man as chief. But the Soninka still kept their Cassie or priestess, who right down to the present is still the repository of spiritual power. But elsewhere the people see women as having played a role of the highest importance in the historical evolution of the nations. As daughters, sisters, wives and mothers of kings, they were well placed to influence events. Buji is an astonishing example. Who was in turn daughter, sister, wife and mother of a king, and well deserves her title of Swanomula or mother of the Lunda people. The famous Amina, who in the 15th century conquered on Zaria's behalf so many towns and lands in Hausa country which still bear her name, is only one example among thousands of that idea of their own historical authority which women were able to impose on African society. This idea is still alive in Africa today as a result of the part played by WOMEN in the Algerian War and within the political parties during the nationalist struggle for independence in the Southern Sahara. True, African women have also been used for pleasure and ornament, as if suggested when we see the king of Dahomey presiding at a feast surrounded by ladies wearing imported materials. But in the same ceremony there were also the Amazons who were the spearhead of the royal army against Oyo and against the colonial invaders at the Battle of Cana 1892. African women have always been regarded as playing an eminent role in the history of the people, through the part they play in agriculture, crafts and trade, by their influence over their sons, whether those sons be princes or peasants, and by their cultural vitality. There always have been, and always will be, battles for or by women. Women themselves have often accepted a role of traitress or seductress, as in the case of Sanjita's sister, or of the women sent to his enemies by the king of Sikau, Amonson. Despite the fact that they appear to be segregated at public gatherings, everyone in Africa knows that women are omnipresent. Women is life, and the promise of a fuller life. And it is through her that peoples sanction their alliances. She may speak little in public, but in the privacy of the home she makes and breaks events. As the proverb puts it, women can make or mar anything. On the whole, it is as if, in Africa, the persistence of elementary community structures throughout historical evolution had made the whole historical process in Africa a remarkably popular one. The smallness of the societies concerned made history the business of everyone. Although, despite telecommunication by talking drums, efficient means of communication were lacking, the limited nature of historical space meant that it was too. Among these people power is transmitted through the milk, though admittedly this is strengthened by the link of blood, but among the Serko power is handed down only through the milk. 48. The place of history in African society. Within everyone's mental grasp. Hence the incontestably democratic nature of most Africans' conception of history. Everyone felt he mattered, and that he could in the last resort escape from dictatorship if only by seceding and taking refuge elsewhere. Shaka himself had this experience at the end of his career. This feeling of making history even on the scale of the village microcosm, and on the other hand the feeling of being only an atom in the historical current created at the top by a king seen as a demiurge, are very important factors for the historian. For they in themselves are historical facts, and help in their turn to create history. African time is a historical time, but can African time be regarded as a historical time? Some people have said it cannot, arguing that the African only sees the world as a stereotyped reproduction of what has gone before. This would make him a stubborn disciple of the past, justifying all his actions by saying, that was how our ancestors did it. If that had really been the case, Ibn Battuta, instead of finding the empire of Mali, would have found only prehistoric communities living in caves and clothed in skins. The social nature of the African conception of history itself lends it a historical dimension, for history is the developing life of a group. From this point of view, we may say that, for the African, time is dynamic. MBN is not a prisoner marking time, or condemned to do the same things over and over again, either in the traditional view or according to Islamic beliefs. So of course, in the absence of the idea of a mathematical and physical time made up of homogeneous units added together and measured by special instruments, time remains something pragmatic and social. But that does not mean, in this context, something neutral and indifferent. In the Black African overall conception of the world, Time is the arena where man can always carry on the struggle against the depletion and for the increase of his vital energy. That is the main feature of African animism, 3, in which time is an enclosed space, a market where the forces that inhabit the world contend or conclude bargains. The ideal of both the individual and the group is to defend themselves against any diminution, to improve their health and strength and the size of their fields and flocks, to increase the number of their children, married wives and villages. And this conception is undoubtedly a dynamic one. The Serko and Sonyanka clans of the Songhai Niger are antagonists. The first, which represents the past and tries to reign over the night, attacks society. The second, which is master of the day, represents the present and defends society. Here is a significant stanza from a Songhai magical invocation. 3. Animism, or rather traditional African religion, is characterized by worship of God and of the powers of intermediary spirits. 49. Methodology and African prehistory. It is not from my mouth, it is from the mouth of A, who gave it to B, who gave it to C, who gave it to D, who gave it to E, who gave it to F, who gave it to M. May mine be better in my mouth than in the mouth of the ancestors. The African is always seeking justification from the past. But this invocation does not signify a static state or contradict the general law of progress and the growth of power. Hence the line, my mine be better in my mouth than in the mouth of the ancestors. Power in Black Africa is often expressed by a word that means force or strength. For this synonymy shows the importance the African peoples attach to force, if not violence, in the unfolding of history. But it is not just a matter of crude material force. It is a question of the vital energy which contains various polyvalent forces ranging from physical integrity through chance to moral integrity. Ethical value is regarded as a sine qua non of the beneficent exercise of power. Popular wisdom bears witness to this idea in many tales which depict despotic chiefs who are finally punished, thus literally drawing the moral of history. The Tariq al-Svedian and the Tariq al-Fatash are full of praises for the virtues of al-Hajj Askia Muhammad. It is true that both accounts had material interests in mind, but they systematically relate the ruler's virtues to his being fortunate. The same thought is to be found in Muhammad Bello, who urges Yakuba Gayatri to meditate on the history of the Songhai Empire. It was thanks to his justice that Muhammad Askia was able not only to maintain but also to increase the legacy of Sunni barley. And it was when the sons of Askia departed from the justice of Islam that their empire disintegrated into a number of weak principalities. According to the son of Usman Dan Fodio, the same principle applied to their own government: look back on the past, on all those who once commanded before us. Before us there were age-old dynasties in the Hausa country. In them, many peoples acquired great powers, but these crumbled because they departed from their foundation in justice and from their customs and traditions, and because they were weakened by injustice. If we are to endure, our force must be the force of truth and of Islam. The fact that we slew the 5 and destroyed the work of Nafada, 5 Abership, 5 and the Wasauort so 5 meter the white impress present generations even outside the influence of Islam. But the generations that come after us will not see all that. They will judge us by the worth of the organization we leave them, by the permanent force of Islam which we have established, and by the truth and justice we have been able to impose in the state. For Thang, Ho and Pan, in Bambara, Moor and Samo respectively. 5. Princes of Godir. So, the place of history in African society. This lofty view of a role of ethics in history does not derive solely from the Islamic beliefs of the Sokoto leader. In animist belief too there is the idea that the order of the cosmic forces may be disturbed by immoral deeds, and that the resulting disequilibrium can only harm its author. This vision of the world in which ethical values and requirements form an integral part of the ordering of the universe itself may appear mythical. But it exerted an objective influence on people's behavior, especially on that of many African political leaders. In this sense one may say that while history is often the justification of the past, it is also an exhortation for the future. In pre-state systems, moral authority capable of guaranteeing the conduct of public affairs or of chastising those who conducted them was vested in special, sometimes secret groups, such as the Lo of the Senufo or the Paro of Upper Guinea. These groups often constituted parallel powers which could be appealed to outside the established system. They sometimes ended by clandestinely usurping official power. The He people then saw them as the cult centers of decision, depriving the nation of control over its own history. In the same type of society, the organization into age groups is of prime importance for establishing the people's history. This structure, insofar as it conforms to a known periodicity, makes it possible to trace history back to the 18th century. But at the same time it played a specific role in the life of the societies themselves. Even in rural communities which knew no major technical innovation and were therefore fairly stable, conflict between the generations was not unknown. So it had to be controlled, and relations between the generations so structured that the conflict would not degenerate into violent confrontation and sudden change. The He generation engaged in action sent one of its members as a delegate to the next generation, the one that would immediately succeed it. The He role of the delegate was not to stifle the impatience of the younger group, but to channel their reckless energy so that it was not harmful to the community as a whole and did not impair the younger group's ability to take over public responsibility when the time came. 6. Africans are vividly aware of time past, but time past, though it greatly influences time present, does not do away with its dynamism, as is attested by many proverbs. The He conception of time as one sees it in African societies is certainly not inherent in or consubstantial with some essentially African nature. It is the mark of a certain stage in economic and social development. Proof of this is the striking differences one sees even today between the time is money of African city dwellers and time as it is understood by their contemporaries and brothers in the bush. The He essential element in historical time is the idea of a development starting from origins which are to be sought after and examined. Even beneath the crust of tales and legends and the dross of myths, there is an attempt to rationalize social development. 6. For example, the Aladians of Musu near Abidjan are still organized into 5 generations, each reigning for 9 years, even for modern activities such as building, celebrating a diploma or promotion, and so on. 51. Methodology and African prehistory. Sometimes even more positive efforts have been made to try to calculate historical time. This may be linked with space, as when a very short time is referred to as the time needed to take a pace. It can also be linked to biology, in references to a breath, in or out. But it is often linked to factors not connected with the individual, and the references then are to cosmic, climatic or social phenomena, especially when these are recurrent. In the savannah of the Sudan, the followers of traditional African religions usually count age by rainy seasons. To indicate that a man is old, one says how many rainy seasons he has lived through, or, more elliptically, that he has drunk much water. More developed systems of computation have sometimes been attempted. 7. But the decisive step will come only with the spread of writing, though the existence of a literate class is no guarantee that the whole people will become aware of possessing a common history. But at least it makes it possible to establish certain points of reference around which that history is shaped. The introduction of monotheistic religions rooted in another history is served to provide the mental image of the collective past with another, parallel set of model which can often be glimpsed in the background in various stories. For example, the dynasties are often linked arbitrarily to the sources of Islam, whose values and ideals the black prophets were to make use of to change the course of events in their own countries. But the greatest upheaval in time comes with the introduction of the world of profit, and the amassing of money. Then acculturation changes the sense of individual and collective time into the mental schemas operative in the countries which influence Africans economically and culturally. The Africans then see that it is money that makes history. African MBN, once so close to his history that he seems to be creating it himself, in micro-societies, is then confronted both with the risk of a colossal alienation and with the opportunity of being a co-author of world progress. 7. Thus Ivor Wilkes, in criticizing the book by D. P. The Chronology of Oral Tradition, Quest for a Chimera, shows that the Akinfanti, Asante, had evolved a complex calendar system, with a week of 7 days, a month of 6 weeks and a year of 9 months, which was regularly realigned on the sun by methods that are not yet fully understood. The Akan calendar could thus be used to refer, say, to the 18th day of the 4th month of the reign of Asante Ose Bonsu. This system of dating was still in use in European countries in the 18th and 19th centuries. C. I. Wilkes, 1975, pages 279 ff. 52. Plate 2.1 Bronze statue representing the dynastic power of the Samedi Ojdar Salad food. 53. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. P. D. Curtain. This volume, like the volumes to follow, was planned to show the African past from an African point of view. This is a correct perspective, perhaps the only approach possible to an international effort. It is also the dominant approach among historians of Africa, both in Africa and overseas. For Africans, to know about the past of their own societies is a form of self-knowledge crucial to a sense of identity in a diverse and rapidly changing world. A recovery of African history has been an important part of African development over recent decades, not an expensive thrill that could be set aside until more pressing aspects of development were well in hand. This is why historians in Africa and overseas were first concerned to step across the remains of colonial history and begin again with the historical experience of African peoples. Other chapters and other volumes will deal with this recovery, with history as a living tradition that still flourishes, with a role of historical knowledge in building new educational systems for independent Africa. This chapter, however, is concerned with the meaning of African history, first for the international community of historians and secondly for the broader educated public outside Africa. The fact that African history was seriously neglected until the 1950s is only one symptom of a large phenomenon in historical studies. The colonial period in Africa left an intellectual legacy to be overcome, just as it had in other parts of the world. Europeans conquered and ruled over most of Asia in the 19th century, while in the tropical America's underdevelopment and the domination of the Afro-American and Indian populations by Europeans reproduced the conditions of colonialism, even though the conventions of international law showed a series of independent states. The colonial imprint on historical knowledge emerged in the 19th and early 20th centuries as a false perspective, a Eurocentric view of world history created at a time of European domination. It was then transmitted outward through the educational systems the Europeans had created in the colonial world. Even where Europeans never ruled, European knowledge was often accepted as modern knowledge, including aspects of the Eurocentric historiography. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. Much of the Eurocentric worldview has now disappeared from the best recent historical research, but it is still dominant with many historians and with the broader public in the non-Western as in the Western world. It has lasted so long because most people learned history in school and found no opportunity to relearn it in later life. Even research historians sometimes find it difficult to keep up with new research outside their own field of study. Textbooks tend to lag behind the most recent research by 10 to 20 years, and other general historical works often carry on the outworn biases of past learning. Every new interpretation, every new datum, has something of a struggle for acceptance. In spite of these delays between discovery and acceptance as knowledge, historical studies in the world at large are passing through a dual revolution that began shortly after the Second World War and is not yet finished. The part is the transformation of history from chronicle into the social science concerned with change in human societies. The other involves the replacement of national bias by a broader view based on a world perspective. Contributions to these new movements have come from all sides, from Europe itself, from historians in Africa, Asia and Latin America, from the overseas Europeans of North America and Oceania. Their effort to extend the scope of history embraced both peoples and regions previously neglected, and aspects of human experience formerly buried under a narrow tradition of political and military history. In this setting, the better knowledge of African history would have been a valuable contribution. But this would have been to let African history appear to be just another parochial history, valuable enough for self-knowledge, as an aid to African development, but not as the most significant kind of contribution to the new view of world history. Historical parochialism was, indeed, one of the most deeply embedded aspects of the older historical tradition. The best history in the first half of the 20th century barely began to outgrow an ancient sentiment that considered history to be a semi-private possession, that saw the history of any particular society as valuable to itself but irrelevant to others. The interest in one's history on the part of foreigners was at best a form of snooping, at worst academic espionage. This emphasis on history as art history was especially strong in the European tradition of the early 20th century. departments of education tended to define history as national history, not even the general European history, much less a balanced view of. The term West is used in this chapter to refer to those parts of the world that are culturally European, or whose culture is dominantly derived from Europe, including the Americas, the USSR, Australia and New Zealand. 55. Methodology and African prehistory. World history. History was consciously mythical, designed to build national pride and willingness to sacrifice for the national cause. As Lord Macaulay put it, history was partly narrative art and partly a vehicle of ethical and political instruction. It was supposed to inculcate patriotism, not to give a balanced view of human development, and this attitude is still dominant in most educational systems. A few historians objected in the name of scholarship, and a few in the name of imperialism, but most accepted the nationalist bias as normal if not desirable. It is still possible in France to earn the title of agrégé in history with minimal knowledge of Europe beyond French frontiers, to say nothing of Asia, Africa or America. It is still possible to earn the Bacchanal degree in several English universities on the basis of English history alone. And the use of English not British is symptomatic. The English schoolboy is likely to know more Roman history than Welsh, Scottish or Irish history before the 18th century. Same is the case in Eastern Europe, though with different ideological overtones. Only the smaller European countries like the Benelux group or Scandinavia seem to stretch out towards a broader focus on Europe as a whole. Nevertheless, the North American history of civilization approach and its European equivalent was still ethnocentric, asking how did we come to be as we are? Not how did mankind come to be as we find it today? The task of moving on to a view of world history in which Africa, Asia and Latin America would have an internationally recognized role belonged partly to the historians who sprang from the culture of these continents who gradually overthrew the Eurocentric view of their own history. It belonged more particularly to those historians who crossed the cultural lines in their own work, to the African historians who began to write about Asia or Latin America, to the Europeans or North Americans who began to interpret African or Asian history to their own people, consciously trying to free themselves of the old Eurocentric bias. A role of historians of Africa, in Africa and overseas alike, was especially important in this general effort if only because African history had been more neglected than that of other non-European regions and because African history had been even more distorted by racist myths. Owing to its protean character, racism is one of the most difficult scourges to stamp out. From the 16th century racism found various forms of expression, some of which were extreme and led to genocide at certain periods, in particular at the time of the slave trade and during the Second World War. It still survives as a monstrous challenge in South Africa and elsewhere despite what UNESCO 3 and other institutions have done to demonstrate its irrational nature. It takes a long time to uproot prejudice. Racism pervades and 2. Thomas Babington Macaulay, Minutes of February 2, 1835 on Education for India, widely reprinted, most recently in P.D. Curtin, 1971, pages 182 fr. 3. Cf. Chapter 11. 56. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general permeates school textbooks, biases radio and television programs and films, and influences the not altogether conscious mental attitudes occasionally transmitted by religious education and even more frequently by ignorance and obscurantism. In this battle, the scientific teaching of the history of peoples is a weapon of overriding strategic importance. Western pseudo-scientific theories of race in the 19th century assigned positions on a scale of ability to physical differences, and as the most obvious physical difference was skin color, they put Africans at the bottom of the scale automatically because they seemed to be most different from themselves. They went on to claim that African history had no importance or value, since Africans could not have produced a true civilization, and any trait worthy of admiration must have been borrowed from their neighbors. Africans were thus made objects of history, never its subjects, since they were held to be capable of receiving foreign influences without contributing anything to the world at large. Pseudo-scientific racism reached its maximum influence long ago, in the first decade of this century, dwindling among social and physical scientists after the 1920s and virtually disappearing from respectable scientific circles after 1945. but the heritage of pseudo-scientific racism lived on. It was supported at the level of folk knowledge by a rise in urban racial tensions, as migrants of African or Asian descent appeared in greater numbers in western cities, and signs of popular prejudices are still apparent. It was supported by the fact that people remembered their school learning, and those educated in the 1910s, when pseudo-scientific racism was the received doctrine of the biological sciences, only reached the normal age of retirement in the 1960s. The far more insidious survival was the fact that conclusions based on racist evidence could live on after the supporting evidence had died. The proposition that Africa had no significant history because Africans are racially inferior became untenable, but intellectuals in the West still remembered vaguely that Africa has no history, even though they may have forgotten why. In this, as in other attitudes, the heritage of racism reinforced a continuing cultural chauvinism which tended to regard Western civilization as the only true civilization. In the late 1960s, the BBC produced a long television series entitled simply Civilization and concerned exclusively with the cultural heritage of Western Europe. Some other societies were sometimes credited as civilized, but the COMMOM distinction between civilized and uncivilized at the middle of this century was the possession of literacy. This placed African societies that had been mostly non-literate in the pre-colonial period in the primitive category. But most of Africa was, in fact, literate in the sense that a class of scribes knew how to read and write, though not, of course, in the sense of mass literacy, which was a post-industrial phenomenon everywhere. Ethiopia has its ancient writing in Jizz. All of Islamic Africa used the Arabic script from the north coast, the Sahara, the northern fringe of the Sudan from Senegal to the Red Sea, and 57. Methodology and African prehistory. The coastal cities down the east coast to the Mozambique Channel. Even before the colonial period, Arabic had penetrated the tropical forests with the Daula traders, while Portuguese, English or French were used in written form as the normal language of commerce along the western coasts. Cultural chauvinism plus ignorance nevertheless led Western authorities to draw the line between literacy and non-literacy at the edge of the desert, contributing further to the unfortunate tendency to separate North African history from that of the rest of the continent. But the exclusion of the uncivilized from the realm of history was only one part of a much larger aspect of the Western historical tradition. The Western masses were also excluded, not, perhaps, through overt class prejudice but because of history's didactic character, where the praise of famous men held out model for emulation. It was hardly chance that the model were usually the rich and powerful, and that history became the account of events within a narrow elite. It played down or left out altogether patterns of behavior that affected the mass of society. Intellectual history was not the history of what people thought, it was the history of great ideas. Economic history was not the history of the economy or of economic behavior, it was the history of important government economic policies, private firms and innovations in economic life. If European historians were fundamentally uninterested in a large part of their own society, they were not likely to be much interested in other societies or other cultures. At this point, the two revolutionary tendencies in recent historical studies ran closely parallel. Eurocentric history and elitist history drew on the same roots. But a working alliance of those seeking a broader coverage of Western society and those seeking a broader sweep of historical study beyond the West was slow to emerge. At first, each group moved forward on its own front. Historians of Africa were mainly concerned to beat back the assertion that Africa had no history or no history worth knowing. In the first instance, it was easiest to take the argument on the opponent's terms. If opponents claimed Africa had no history, African specialists could point to kingdoms and large empires that did indeed have a political history that read like early aspects of European history. The bias towards the feeling of superiority of the Western public and the Western-trained African public could be used as a lever to prove that African history was important after all. But this was a weak argument, because it concerned only those aspects of the African past that resemble the Western past, without really meeting the problems of cross-cultural misunderstanding. In the early stages of recovering African history, few historians recognize that empires are often cruel and unpleasant institutions and are not necessarily a sign of political progress. FEW were ready to acknowledge that, for example, Africa's great achievement in law and politics was probably the stateless society, based on cooperation rather than coercion, not to mention the fact that the African states had been so organized as to preserve genuine local autonomy. 58. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. This tendency to accept some aspects of the old historiography as a first stage in decolonizing African history had its most serious effect in the study of the colonial period, where an established colonial history already existed, tending to emphasize European activities and leave out the African factor. At its worst, it showed Africans as barbarians whose will and judgment were weak or ill-directed. Therefore, it implied, superior beings from Europe came in and did what the Africans could not have done for themselves. Even at its best, colonial history allowed Africans only secondary roles on the historical stage. The first effort to correct this view was simply to change the value judgments, leaving the roles unchanged. Explorers, colonial governors and military officers became cruel exploiters, not heroes in the march of civilization. The Africans became innocent victims, but they were still kept in passive roles. A handful of Europeans were still depicted as the main force making African history what it was. Europeans sometimes did play crucial roles in the history of the colonial period, but every later revision based on new research at a local level shows the European role to have been much less important than it appeared in the colonial history published before 960 or so. A second step in decolonizing the history of the colonial period came with the rise of nationalist movements demanding independence. Here were African figures playing a role in history, and it was appropriate to give due weight to that role. Political scientists writing at the time of the independence movements were among the first to enter this field. For a little later, mainly in the 1960s, scholars began to push back through time to find the roots of resistance and protest movements in the early colonial period, or earlier still in primary resistance to European rule. 5. These accounts of resistance and protest movements were an important corrective, but were still less than a balanced view of African history. The ultimate decolonization of African history in the colonial period will have to come from a merger of the anti-Eurocentric revolt and the anti-elitist revolt. The behavioral revolution has already begun to influence the historiography of Africa, but that influence is still recent and limited, and much of the research is still unpublished. Some historians have adopted an interdisciplinary approach, seeking to use the contribution of other social sciences such as the history of agriculture or the history of urbanization. Others are beginning to look at single, small regions, hoping to use microcosmic studies to illuminate larger and still more complex patterns of. C. For example, T. Hodgkin, 1956, D. Capters, 1955, J. S. Coleman, 1958, C. A. Julian, 1952. 5. C. For example, G. Shepperson and T. Price, 1958, T. O. Granger, 1967, J. Elliott, 1969, R. I. Rutberg and A. Amos Ruiz, 1970, Y. Person, 1968-70. 59. Methodology and African prehistory. Social or economic change. 6. Research is beginning to push vigorously at some of the special problems of economic and religious history, but the true decolonization of African history in these fields has only just begun. And the important step in this direction is the gradual development of analytical history that is also field history, that is, the product of oral interviews and on-the-spot investigation, not simply immersion in archives. Independence from archival sources is proving to be as important for the colonial period as it is for the pre-colonial, where archival sources are comparatively rare. The problem with colonial history has been, all along, that those who created the archives and left the records were foreigners. These records necessarily incorporate their biases and attitudes towards themselves, towards those they governed, and towards the roles expected of each. This is just as true of government records in Europe or North America, where the bias is simply pro-government. In the colonial world it can lead to disastrous results, especially if the historian neglects to bring in another point of view through oral interviews with living people who experienced colonial rule. Historians of Africa have been pioneers in the use of oral traditions, not so much for the colonial period as for the pre-colonial, and this work was mostly done in two clusters. Between about 1890 and 1914, A generation of scholar administrators in the service of colonial governments began the task of recording oral traditions of historical importance. The second cluster occurred in the past 15 years. The decade of the 1950s ended with G.P. Murdoch's dictum of 1959 that indigenous oral traditions are completely undependable. The decade of the 1960s opened with the publication of January Vangson's Oral Tradition, a study in historical methodology, showing the critical controls that were necessary if oral traditions were to become a dependable source. The recent historical work based on oral tradition, often used in conjunction with other sources, has been an impressive achievement. The Dakar seminar organized in 1961 by the International African Institute on the theme of the historian in tropical Africa, and the one held in Dar es Salaam in 1965 on an NEW view of African history, vigorously emphasized the new approaches required, stressing in particular the unique role of oral tradition as a source of African history and all the benefits to be reaped by the historian from linguistics and archaeology informed by oral tradition. Historians of Africa have already influenced the other social sciences through their work on the pre-colonial period. This influence made itself felt at several levels. Its most general impact was to force the recognition that 6. C. P. Hill, 1963. 7. G. P. Murdoch, 1959, page 43. 8. C. For example, J. Vankson, 1973, Arcade. Kent, 1970, D. W. Cohen, 1972, the work of E. J. Alagoa, partly summarized in Alagoa, 1971, 80. Roberts Education 1968 C. D. T. Nyanet, 1960 D. 60. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. Traditional Africa had not been static. Economists, political scientists and sociologists all have a tendency to discuss modernization by reference to a before and after model, where before was traditional society taken to be virtually changeless and the after was the process of modernization where dynamic change enters the picture. Historians, as students of change, looked for the change that takes place constantly in human societies, and their research of recent decades has shown that African pre-colonial institutions, social customs, patterns of life, religions and economies were all changing as rapidly as they changed in other societies between the agricultural and industrial revolutions. The rate was not as rapid as it was to become in the post-industrial age, which affects industrialized Africa, but the assumption of a static traditional past was no longer acceptable. The problems created by using the static, traditional base or point of departure were most serious for anthropologists. Since the 1920s most anthropologists in the English-speaking world have worked with a model of society which emphasized the way in which each part of the total culture functioned to maintain the whole as a working entity. They recognized that the African societies they were investigating had changed a great deal since the beginning of colonial rule, but they took that fact as an unfortunate aberration in the data. They saw it. The picture had to be adjusted by focusing on a single temporal plane set somewhere in the not very distant past before the European conquest. They assumed that the nature of this traditional society could be discovered by taking present, observed data and subtracting everything that seemed to be an external influence. The result was what they called the anthropological present. This functionalist approach owed most to Bronislaw Malinowski, who dominated British anthropology in the 1920s and 1930s. It went a long way towards understanding how simple societies work, and the functionalists made other important advances by their insistence on prolonged and careful field investigation through participant observation, not simply questioning informants. But it also had some unfortunate corollaries. It led anthropologists to seek out simple societies and isolated cultures. This very selectivity distorted Western knowledge of African culture by leaving great gaps in the accounts of large or complex African societies, thus adding to the myth of a primitive Africa. The effort to abstract the anthropological present from the real present also furthered the assumption that change in Africa must come from an outside influence, since their assumptions made African societies appear changeless till the Europeans arrived. The anthropologists' effort to stabilize the model society in order to describe its functional operations led many to forget that the society they treated as static for analytical purposes was not really static. Most serious of all, The static assumption distracted them from asking how or why the society under scrutiny had changed, which might have produced quite a different picture. Functionalism would no doubt have run its course in any case, without 61. Methodology and African prehistory. The influence of history. It was being modified by the acculturation studies of the 1940s and 1950s, while Claude Lévi-Strauss and his followers were moving off in quite a different direction in the post-war decades. Nevertheless, in political anthropology and some aspects of social anthropology, the work of pre-colonial historians helped call attention to the dynamics of change and helped set anthropology on a new path. The study of African religions and religious organizations also changed through the influence of recent historical research. The earlier students of African religion tended either to be anthropologists in search of a static body of belief and practice, or else missionaries who also accepted the concept of an anthropological present in studying religions they hoped to supplant. They recognized that Islam was dynamic enough, since it had spread even more rapidly than Christianity had during the colonial period, but the most important studies of Islam in North Africa and West Africa were sponsored by the French colonial government as a check to possible dissidents. These studies tended to center on religious leaders and organizations, not on the process of change within the religion. In recent decades, though, the study of change in African religions was renewed from several sources, not from historians alone. Missionologists were concerned with the development of new African religions with a partly Christian basis, and with the independent churches that split off from the European missions. Anthropologists interested in culture change took up similar studies, and historians have joined in strongly, drawn at first by their concern with the role of religion in colonial rebellion and protest movements. For the pre-colonial period, they have also come to recognize the obvious and enormous importance of religious reform in the Islamic world as a whole. The result has been an increased awareness that non-Christian, and Muslim religions were also changing, though social scientists in varying disciplines are only now beginning to study these patterns of change as systematically as they deserve. Another point worth noting is the new interest in the indigenous animist religions and in the associations and societies, sometimes secret, which have often played the decisive role in the development of the African peoples. While social scientists of many disciplines seem to be able to work comfortably together on African religions, with a broad and mutual interchange of methods and concepts, the study of African economies is sharply divided. Economic historians, like the historians of religion, have shown in recent years that African economies were changing continuously and that economic change was as much a response to internal stimuli as it was to overseas influences. Economists, however, and especially development economists, still go about their business without taking into account the economic culture they are trying to manipulate. They tend not only to ignore the process of change already taking place but also to ignore the static models of the economic anthropologists. It suited the purposes of development theory, for example, to assume that 62. Recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. Africa was largely made up of subsistence economies where each family unit produced nearly all the goods and services it consumed. This view was especially publicized by H.L.A. Meehan in the mid-1960s with the Vent-Forsser's theory of economic development based on the liberation of underemployed resources and factors of production. 9. In fact, no community in pre-colonial Africa was self-sufficient in the sense of having no trade at all, and many African societies had complex patterns of specialized production and export to their neighbors. MENY pastoral people along the fringes of the Sahara earned half or more of their annual calorie intake by exchange of animal products for cereals. MENY other people regularly produced and sold an agricultural surplus so as to be able to pay for specialized products that came from long-distance trade such as salt, cattle, shea butter, cola nuts or dates. The error underlying the static picture of African economies was, of course, the familiar myth of primitive Africa, reinforced by the anthropologists' tendency to seek out the simplest communities and by their former tendency to suppress time depth in their data. Those economists and economic anthropologists who have studied African economies on the spot have, of course, recognized the importance of trade in pre-colonial Africa, and a few recognized that African economies had been changing quite rapidly before foreigners appeared in force. One group, however, had moved away from the main line of economic thought by emphasizing the differences rather than the similarities of economic cultures. This group, sometimes called substantivists, because of their insistence on studying the substantive nature of production and consumption, trying to relate the way the end meets his material needs to the broad patterns of a particular society and not to formal theory, have tended to claim that economic theory is not applicable to their field of research. The result is a broad gap between development economists, who work with macroeconomic theory and pay little attention to present economic facts, and the substantivists who avoid cross-cultural theory and stress microeconomic descriptions. So far, economic historians have not filled the gap, nor have they influenced economic thought about Africa to the same extent that historians have influenced anthropology or religious studies. African history has made great strides in recent years, especially in pioneering some new methods and in filling a large historical gap that had hardly been explored. In the process, however, it has sometimes fallen behind other changes that have taken place in the historiography of other societies. It has not responded as rapidly as some fields of study to the challenge of the behavioral revolution, nor has it kept up with the new and exciting kinds of work that can be done in quantitative history, either in political history or in historical econometrics. 9. H. Meant, 1964. 10. For a convenient summary of the position, see George Alton, Education, 1968. 63. Methodology and African Prehistory. Alongside the growth of research about the African past, the influence of the new African history depended on a core of professional historians principally concerned with African history in their teaching and writing. The reason why African history has lagged behind in the West, even behind the historiography of Asia or Latin America, was the fact that it was mainly the work of non-professional historians, and who did something else for a living, had no established place in the university world, and therefore had little opportunity to influence the historical profession in any Western country. Some research on Africa was carried out in research institutes in Scandinavia and in Central and Eastern Europe even before the Second World War, but that research was almost always marginal to the overall pattern of higher education. It did not lead, therefore, to the training of historians. The only exceptions were in Egyptology and certain aspects of North African history in the Roman period. Otherwise, few of the pre-1950 historians of Africa were professional historians. Some were colonial administrators, some were missionaries. Others were African clerics or clergymen who wrote in one of the international languages, like Carl Christian Riendorf of the Gold Coast, Samuel Johnson for the Yoruba, or Sheikh Musa Kamara of Senegal, whose Zuhur al-Basad in Fighters Kh. His Sawadin is not yet published in its entirety and has only recently begun to be used by other historians. The anthropologists also dealt with historical themes, but before 1950 no university in Africa offered a concerted program of specialization in African history at the postgraduate level. In 1950, no professional historian anywhere was exclusively concerned with writing and teaching about African history. 20 years later, about 500 professional historians with a doctorate or equivalent qualification were principally engaged on African history. The speed in this change was surprising but explicable enough in retrospect. In Africa, in Europe and in North America, for different reasons on each continent, the political, intellectual and university setting was peculiarly favorable to the emergence of a professional corps of African historians. In Africa the need was obvious from the late 1940s onwards, when a rapid movement towards independence was predictable, at least for most of North and West Africa. By the 1950s new universities were founded, and with them came a demand for a new kind of African history from an African perspective, first at the university level and then percolating down through the teacher training colleges to the schools. The pioneers in this broad effort at re-education were K. Onyeka Dike, the first of a new generation of African historians to pass through the normal professional training, in this case at the University of London. Expatriate historians also contributed, like J.D. Fidge at the University of Ghana, then the Gold Coast J.D. Hargreaves at Forbay in Sierra Leone, Christopher Wrigley and Cyril Ehrlich at Makerere College in Uganda. 11. S. Johnson, 1921, C. C. Riendorf, 1889, C. M. Kamara, 1970. 64. recent trends in African historiography and their contribution to history in general. The equivalent shift in Francophone Africa came more gradually. In the ex-French territories, the universities continued as a part of the French university system until well after independence, which meant that they kept a French historical curriculum as well. Pioneers nevertheless began working quietly towards an African history. Here, notable contributions came from Amadou Mokhtar Mbow in Senegal, Joseph Kiserbo in Upper Volta, and Pierre Engelbert Mbak in Cameroon. Expatriate historians in Francophone Africa, who were later to make a major contribution in the universities, were already carrying out research by the early 1950s. January Banksana, WHO later helped to introduce African history at Lovanium University in Zaire, was already at work at Belgian government research institutes in the Congo and Rwanda. Raymond Mani, who was later to be a professor of African history at the Sorbonne, was doing research in French West Africa from a base at IFVN in Dakar. Yves Persson, still a colonial official, had begun work on the research that was to lead to his amour in 1968 and to his important role in the introduction of African history at the universities of Abidjan and Dakar. Presence Africaine, through its journal and through its two major congresses of black writers and artists held in Paris and Rome in 1956 and 1959, gave a vigorous impetus to this process. But all of this had to do with the introduction of African historical studies in Africa. The important step for African history's impact on world history was the development of African historical studies on other continents, a process that began nearly simultaneously with university-based African history in Africa itself. By the early 1950s, Roland Oliver had begun teaching African history at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. In the USSR, D. A. Oldrock and his colleagues at the Ethnographic Institute in Leningrad began the systematic research program that was to lead in time to the publication of all known documentation for sub-Saharan Africa dating from 1500 or earlier in the original language, with translation and annotation in Russian. 12 In the same decade, the first chair of African history was created at the Sorbonne, where it soon became two, one occupied by ex-Governor Hubert Deschamps and the other by Raymond Mani. Meanwhile, Henri Punchwig began directing research on African history at the École pratique des hautes études, while Robert Cornevin published the first edition of his Survey of African History, many times revised and enlarged since then. Progress was not quite so rapid beyond Europe and Africa, and even in Europe, African history was first admitted into university curricula in those countries that had had colonies in Africa. One might have expected a concern about African history in the Americas, where a large part of the population was of African descent, but interest was slight in Brazil and the Caribbean, even though African cultural survivals were strongest there.